Hello, everybody. Thank you for
Hello,
joining
hello.
us. Hello. This is the second WebAssembly Fireside Chat that we are doing for Wasm.builders, the WebAssembly community that we help run alongside a bunch of other great teams like Fermion, Cosmonic, Lunatic, Profian, and others. And we're all trading off doing these webinars, live streams, and this is our turn to host, and I'm really glad that we get to do so. So I'm just here to introduce and be a bit of an MC, but Ramon here from the Suborbital team is going to be running the show. Ramon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a developer advocate, developer relations advocate here at Suborbital. I've been learning a lot about WebAssembly. I've been developing software for 12 years, and just having a great time. And I'm super excited to be here and help lead this fireside chat.
Awesome. And Ramon's going to be talking with Brian Sletten. He's the author of this wonderful book that I have in my hand here, WebAssembly, The Definitive Guide. Do you want to introduce yourself, Brian?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. The WebAssembly community is really inspiring, and was what sort of motivated me to get the book going. So I'm honored to be here and to also reflect everything that you all are doing as well. So I'm excited by what's coming.
That's awesome. Yeah, I have the page in your book bookmarked where you mentioned Suborbital, because I once I finished reading it, I wanted to be able to go back and find that. So Suborbital right there, and I really enjoyed reading it when it first came out, and yeah, I'm excited to hear more about it. So I think I will say sayonara and let the two of you get to it. So welcome to the Wasm.builders Fireside Chat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Connor. So, thank you again, Brian, for being here, and thanks everybody for joining in. Since this is happening live, I really want to stress this is an open conversation, so please, toss your questions into the chat. We'll bring them on. In fact, for example, I've got a couple folks here already saying hello. Akil is saying good evening. Good evening, Akil. Good to see you. And I've got Flaky here, also from Suborbital, saying ayo. Good to see you, Flaky. Thanks for joining. Yeah, so toss your questions in. Any questions you've got for Brian, if you've got any questions for me. I'm not very, I'm still learning, but I'll try my best to answer. But yeah, thank you so much for joining in, Brian. It was really a joy to read up and read your book and find out about you. Connor very kindly introduced the two of us, and I'd love to get, if I may, ask you a little bit about your technical background, because I get the impression that you've got quite a varied and diverse background in tech.
Yeah. So I got a computer science degree from the College of William and Mary in Southern Virginia. By U.S. standards, it's very old, right? 1693. It was founded. By European standards, that's what, I don't know, kind of a up and coming university. But it was a very theoretical computer science program. For example, at the time, our operating systems class would just assume that we knew C. There was no class to teach us C. We lobbied and got a 1 credit symposium, but overall it was a fantastic experience. And I also love the fact that William and Mary is a liberal arts college, and so I think the combination of the theoretical computer science and the exposure to philosophy and critical thinking and things like that really sort of prepared me for this varied career. And I've done everything from user interface stuff to security consulting to 3D graphics. I was in the video game industry for a while. as well as just a variety of long-term projects with large companies, just kind of help them stop from stepping on themselves. So you could basically say about half my career has been really, really fun stuff, about 10 to 15 years ahead of the industry, and the other half has been sort of just more general business consulting. And I find both very, very rewarding, but it's been a nice mix.
Yeah, and I bet that thank you, and I bet that mix is what's kind of helped you sort of, because I've had a bit of a, I mean, probably to a much smaller scale, had a bit of a similar experience, doing some very theoretical university stuff here in Vienna, and then going into more practical freelance work has kind of helped me. I find it humbling in a way to be able to see, how the relationship between what is expected of the theory of computer science versus how it's applied quite exciting, especially when it comes to emerging technologies, which is something that you're quite involved in. I've found
it is, and it was not an intentional thing, right? I kind of found myself in these spaces. 25 years ago, I was involved in what was the first whole Earth visualization project at a company called Autometric, and it was basically like Google Earth, but quite a long time ago. And we were doing terabytes of digital terrain information, hyperspectral imagery, satellite sensors, and modeling. We were pulling video frames off of Predator drones and warping them to the Earth. But at the same time, we were also innovating around the user interface. And like our entire application was driven by the command pattern a year before the Gang of Four book came out. So you could open up like 10 windows and drop, terabytes of information into display in those windows, and then position the eye and start the clock, and all these sorts of things would happen because the commands would be macroed and replay them. And so, just doing really hard, challenging, fun stuff like that kind of predisposed me to not want to do sort of typical business application sorts of things, as crucial as those things are.
Sure.
I just didn't think that was going to be, keep my attention or keep me interested. And yet at the same time, I've spent a long time helping teams grow, and I put together a team at Best Buy and designed their first commerce API. So, it was just a hypermedia based REST API for building or for interacting with their backend systems. And in its first year, it became, a ridiculously successful non-cannibalizing revenue stream. So third parties like credit card companies could convert point conversions into purchases. And, even something like that is just very satisfactory and satisfying to bring into account, particularly because they were originally told it would take 2 years. And I took a team with no background in Spring, REST, Agile testing or anything, and got the first version out in 6 months. And, it was a good experience. So, you touched upon, I think, another interesting part that I meant to follow up further with the discussion of my background, which was I like to understand why things work and where they come from. And I think that's where the liberal arts part comes in, right? And I find myself kind of increasingly not isolated, but it doesn't seem a lot of people these days spend that kind of time understanding where things come from and why particular choices make sense. And so in my teaching and my training, obviously in the shape of the book, that was a big part of helping people understand why I think WebAssembly is one of many technologies that is quite literally going to transform our industry.
I agree with you. I think it's. I remember. I'm sorry. I don't want to take up too much time, but I remember a story that I used to teach kids to code, right? And they what I love about teaching kids is that they would we were making games, right? Like 2-dimensional games. And one of my favorite things that they do is that they ask questions. They question everything that I was doing. They're like, and one of my favorite questions was, when we were doing when we were coding, when we were drawing characters on the screen, right? They would have you needed to have your coordinates, right? You needed to have your X coordinate, your Y coordinate. And the origin, that is when both values are 0, would be the top left of the screen. And one of the kids asked me, it's like, when I was doing math in class, yeah. And they asked me why. And one thing that I realized is I took for granted why. I was just like, well, that's just how this framework works. But so we went and investigated, and we found out that this is because of the way old CRT monitors worked, right? Yeah. Exactly. So they would render super slowly from left to right. But if somebody hadn't questioned that, I wouldn't have wondered, because again, I was eager to get into the world of computer science. And I feel that. And I feel that, that's something I want to start doing more of now in my work. So thank you for putting that so well.
Sure.
We've got some questions from Mark. Is that a Game Boy Pocket back there? Yes, it is. There's one right there. Second question. Suborbital is obviously an all-in on Wasm as a viable foundation for a serverless platform, but Wasm is still a pretty painful development target. What things do you think are missing in order for Wasm to take off as a deployment target for people who aren't already Wasm and Rust enthusiasts? Which of these things do you think are already starting to happen? So this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I would love, Brian, if I don't know if you have an answer to.
Well, yeah, I mean,
it
goes back to what was so ambitious about the book, right? Which was, I didn't know who my audience was. There, when O'Reilly first asked me about it, they said, who do you think is going to read this book? And I said, well, I think there's going to be a certain amount of JavaScript developers wondering, what this WebAssembly stuff was and why people said it was going to kill JavaScript, which it's not. I said, I think, some of it is going to be C++ programmers who are suddenly finding themselves relevant on the web in ways that they hadn't been for a while, at least in the browser and non-backend capabilities, right? And then a third group was just sort of curious people wanting to learn something new. But if you have only ever done JavaScript, you won't have backgrounds with compilers. You won't understand really like what ahead of time optimization sorts of things can happen. And so I was really concerned that, I could write a good book that was useless, right? If if it didn't serve the needs of those reader bases. So I think that's kind of to his point, is that it's a painful process because it is an ambitious process, right? We're trying to bring these different languages together. We're trying to merge platforms and make code portable and tackle a wider, more heterogeneous distributed ecosystem. And the reality is, I don't think there's anything else out there that does it better. Certainly, JavaScript runs everywhere, but as a language, it has limitations in terms of certain kinds of projects and products that it's good for. It's fine for almost everything, but there are these edge cases where a Rust or a C++ will be a better source, or Go, right? And so there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Where do we spend our time adding development tools to make it easier for people until there's more demand? But there's also the other use case of let's just reuse existing code, in which case there doesn't need to be a whole lot of tooling, right? As long as we can target a different backend, and then that backend can be absorbed into a Node, a Dino, or some larger platform like Suborbital and the other companies in the Wasm.builder space are pursuing. So I would say it's early days, right? In terms of where that support is going to come from, where the tooling is going to come from, and what's going to help ease people into this. But the good news is we're seeing more and more of that. with the emergence of PyScript, with the emergence of TinyGo and variations in the Artichoke project, and Zig and Wasm in the browser, and in the cloud. So there's this momentum behind the platform, and I think developers are good at scratching their own itches, right? And we will see things like Wasm BindGen and other tools evolve to support other languages and to become richer in the ecosystems and the round tripping between them. That's one of the things that impresses me the most is I have spent a lot of time in my career looking at cross-platform approaches to things, both from a user interface perspective and a component object model perspective and whatnot. And it just feels like this time we're not there yet, but we're getting it right. We're being very judicious about the approach, not trying to solve everything all at once. But we've got the dream of Java write once, run anywhere, but now with 20 years of experience or 30 years of experience.
Right. And
so we're not forcing everyone into a particular language. We're not forcing everyone to rewrite everything. We're actually trying to say, like, let's avoid doing things, and that way your existing tool chains and build chains and debugging environments and whatnot can still apply. It's just we have sort of like this little side channel that we can then let your code escape and be used in new environments. So, I think to the extent that you said we got a little bit ahead of ourselves with that question, I think the value proposition that WebAssembly brings is beyond safe, fast, and portable. We're able as producers of value to capture that value for a longer period of time and in more ways than we have been able to with traditional platforms and runtimes and tool chains. So it's not in cases always necessary to use a C or a Rust or a Go or something because a choice is not possible in JavaScript. It's just not going to be necessary, right? Yeah. So we can take existing code, reuse it, rebuild it, retarget it, and that way we can focus on what needs to be written, not just rewriting everything all the time.
Thank you for that answer. That kind of has led me sometimes to the sentiment that the best place for WebAssembly to be, and I'm going to get this wrong, so please feel free to disagree with me, is kind of acting in the background. Like the best place for, like, could it be argued that the best place for WebAssembly would be where, people who are developing software in their language, say Python, don't notice WebAssembly because it works for them?
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that.
Yeah.
If you look at Blazor, if you look at Uno, the Uno platform, if you look at, as you said, Pyodide and PyScript, in a lot of those cases, you don't really care about WebAssembly, but it's just an implementation detail to facilitate being able to run .NET in the browser or Python in the browser. And that certainly is an easy use case to absorb and adopt. And I think it's going to be a powerful one because, once people realize you can write pixel perfect applications that run in the browser as desktop applications, as Windows applications, as Linux applications, as Android applications, as iOS applications, or you could take conventional sort of approaches to enterprise software, and lose the pain of installation, gain the power of portability, and yet not have to rely on crazy complicated JavaScript frameworks. I think that's going to be a compelling strategy for enterprises to adopt these ideas. And so again, I don't think there's a right way to use WebAssembly. I think it should be thought of more as an enabling technology than something that forces you into a particular mold.
I like that. And this is, Actually, I've been kind of curious to know, Brian, because you're very keenly interested. You've written the book. Before I forget, folks, here is the link to the book. If you haven't checked it out yet, it is great. I read it myself. I've got a couple things to say about it, but I want to. Oh no, I lost my place. What was I saying? Oh yes. Well, I'm curious to know what your history with WebAssembly is. How'd
Sure,
you come
sure.
to know about it? Because you're quite excited
So
about it.
yeah. So go back in time. I'm young in my career. I'm doing really crazy cool stuff. Again, warping video frames from Predator drones into three-dimensional scenes. In basically real time. Some a couple years later, I'm doing machine learning stuff on idle computers all over the world. These things really sort of like caught my eye, but that to me was real programming. JavaScript was menu engineering, right? We're just like
Menu engineering.
that was the obnoxious phrase I used when one of my friends said that they wanted to learn JavaScript back in the day, and clearly I misunderstood its potential. And it became a serious language and a serious environment, both in the front end and the back end. And so I've always had my eye on the web as a deployment platform. I'm very involved in also, API design, the semantic web, linked data, knowledge graphs, things like that. That's using the web as a platform for machine processable information, to transcend silos and to do some crazy integration outside of particular data storage platforms and whatnot. But every time I looked at the user interface side of developing for the web, I'd rather eat glass. It was not fun. Back in the HTML4 days, things were, quite literally quirky. And I never liked any of the alternatives, right? The applet approach or the Flash approach or the Silverlight approach never really got the web. It was a plugin and it was separated from the platform. So the platform was used to serve it up, but what was served up was not of the web, right? It was sort of like indifferent to being in the web. And so when Google first started playing around with native client and Pinnacle, it caught my attention. I didn't like their approach, just like a lot of people thought they're throwing away the baby with the bathwater by limiting it to Chrome and not having it interact with the DOM and whatnot as naturally. And so when ASM.js emerged, that caught my attention as well. So that's when I really started paying attention, was in Mozilla's response to native clients in Pinnacle. And I kind of lost the thread for a while, but when I started hearing about WebAssembly again, I was able to recontextualize it as sort of part of that same initiative. And it just felt like they finally were getting it right. And so I speak at this conference series called No Fluff, Just Stuff. And it's a kind of a traveling conference, right? It moves around the US. And at the end of December 2016, the guy who runs it sort of sat me down and said, what do you want to talk about next year? And I said, I want to talk about WebAssembly. I said, it's too soon, right? This is back 2016, but it's going to be too long. And so I really appreciate his support. He's like, he's learned to trust me about like where there's interesting things happening. And that really sort of then forced me to start digging into it and the world and the ecosystem of WebAssembly, from the beginning. And I've been advocating for it ever since. But when we had that same conversation in 2018, I'd been doing a lot of machine learning stuff, and I had clients that had taken me around the world to teach people about machine learning, and I was just getting a little tired of it. I mean, it's exciting stuff, but I wanted to talk about new things. And so I said, I would like to focus on less what I think are forward-leaning technologies and focus more on like underappreciated success stories. And so I threw it under the umbrella of modern software development, and in it I threw things like LLVM, right, which was the basis of why Apple's transition to ARM was so easy. WebAssembly, obviously, for all the reasons we're discussing. Architecture as a tool for modernization, so microservices, serverless functions, the kinds of things that Suborbital and Cosmonic and everybody are like embracing as a way of reducing a lot of the infrastructure pain that we've had to manage ourselves to deploy functionality on the back end. Linked data and knowledge graphs as a way of solving data integration problems. And I didn't really think that much about it until the one show that we got off in 2019 before we shut down for the pandemic was in Minneapolis. And so I took each of those topics and put them together, and I gave like 7 or 8 talks that weekend.
Wow.
And it was not until I was actually going through the process of giving the talks that I started to say, and then in this talk that's coming up, you'll see how this connects to that. And by the end of the weekend, I like had this beautiful mind sort of psychotic break moment where I was like, it all makes sense, right? I had this like 12-dimensional synthesis, and I called up my friend Matt Stein and told him about it, and he's like, yeah, you should write a book about this. And I just basically vomited my ideas into an email and sent it to Mike Lukides at O'Reilly. We'd been spending a lot of time talking about emerging technologies and what was interesting. And, I half suspect him to say like, okay, that's cute, but, no. But he was actually very thoughtful. And the next morning I had an amazing response from him. And we spent some time trying to tease it apart, and eventually realized like we don't know how to turn this into a book. But he said, why don't you start with WebAssembly, right? And so that's how the book project got started. But I've come to think about the bigger picture a little bit like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Some friends of mine wrote Thor, and so I was aware that Marvel was making these movies way, a long time ago. But I had no vision for what it was going to become. But I realized what they did was they took a couple of tentpole characters, right? Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, well understood, well liked characters that had a fan base, in and of themselves. And they started to tell their stories, and then they started to interact, right? And then you got more and more of them involved. And then that suddenly allowed the foundation to bring forth the larger narratives of like the Avenger arcs and spinning off into all these different other dimensions. And so that's kind of the approach that I'm taking now about these. I think WebAssembly is my Iron Man, and these other established technologies that have all proven themselves. That's the thing, is they're not speculative, right? Like LLVM is an amazing technology that's driving a lot in our industry. And when you look at the emergence of Apple's transition from x86 to ARM, when you see the meteoric rise of RISC-V as an open source ISA, when you see things like IT sovereignty driving what's happening in China and India and Europe, prior to the pandemic supply chain interruption, but certainly amplified by like, we need to have our own capacity to do stuff like this. And now we have open source hardware, and we have this sort of like new drive towards doing that. At the same time, our code is having to run on cloud devices, desktop devices, edge computing environments, Internet of Things devices, phones, tablets, watches. We need technologies that mediate the hardware differences that are becoming not less ubiquitous, but more ubiquitous. And that's exactly what things like LLVM and WebAssembly are doing. At that intersection, they allow us to smooth over the differences between the hardware so that we can just write our program once, and then it'll run in any of these environments. So there really is a large story about security, about portability, about business value, about, you know, where industries are going. And I think one of the things that people underestimate is how important WebAssembly is to a lot of that.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's really cool. Actually, I wanna highlight a comment here that Flaky said. About the talks themselves. This is the real time version of conference driven development. Seeing how that came about. Same goes for talking about code reuse motivated by the
Mhm.
browser. Um, the improvements of the usability of image code from that effort is now powering command line tools, serverless image transforms, etc. And we've got
Absolutely.
a question, and yeah, totally. And we got a question here from Akila asking, is there a recording of those talks?
Of some number of them. That particular series is has historically been more of like an in-person series, but because of the pandemic, we virtualized a lot of the experience, and we have kind of a hybrid mode now. So if you go to nofluffjuststuff.com, there are a variety of talks and things that are available, but other of my talks are available on YouTube.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just gonna drop a link here to No Fluff Just Stuff. I got a comment from Flaky here saying LLVM itself having been a key enabler for a ton of technologies we consider groundbreaking today, Rust being one of them.
Mhm.
And something, if I may dive into the book, reading it. So I was telling Brian before we started, so I'm going to repeat myself. It's just going to come off as a little insincere because I already told Brian, but he knows what I meant. What I liked about this book is that it really, the definitive guide. What I liked about it is that it did not skip anything, at least for me, who's a relative beginner to WebAssembly. I felt that I was able, everything got explained that needed to be explained. And I very much appreciated that, starting with, explaining, for example, why it is that you can't just print F from a C program in WebAssembly just like that. That to me, having that example, and I think I learned by tripping over things, because that example just made a whole bunch of stuff click for me. Why it is that things like POSIX are so important for something like WebAssembly.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate that, and I wanted to ask, if I may, this wasn't your first experience authoring a book, right?
Mm-mm.
No.
I've contributed to several. O'Reilly's Beautiful Architecture. I wrote a book called Resource-Oriented Architecture Patterns. So applying web ideas to things. Everyone's excited about GraphQL, but that's a pattern I called the named query pattern, 9 years ago. So there's nothing really new about it. It's a different experience writing kind of like a small sort of academic book that was intended to be part of like larger textbook, sort of like dynamic textbook assembles. It was part of the synthesis lecture series on semantic web stuff, versus something that's targeting kind of a more general technology audience. But yeah, I've contributed and written a couple things in the past.
Awesome. Flaky writes, and this is true. I was texting him the other day. Ramon the other day literally channeled Matrix Neo's I Know Kung Fu the other day. Reading the book, he messaged me, Flaky, I think POSIX finally clicked for me. And this is something, yeah, that I really appreciated about the book, because it really was, a full guide. And something you've said that I also found really interesting is that this is a snapshot, isn't it? A snapshot in time of where
Mhm.
WebAssembly is now. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that I
So
found. Sorry,
I was going to say, you said I didn't leave anything out. I left actually a lot of things out that I wanted to talk about, like threading and
really?
SIMD and whatnot. But I just felt like there was already so much in it. And those things were not ubiquitous. They were not widely supported yet in all of the environments. But it pained me to leave them out. But I'm already starting to think about what's the timing on the second edition, because so much has happened since the book finished. That was the experience that I learned with my first book as well. Is books aren't published when they're done. Books are done when they're published. right? And if the world is changing around you so much,
Ooh,
you just have to draw a line in the sand at some point.
yeah.
Because I kept on thinking, oh, there's this, oh, there's this, oh, there's this. And, I wanted to spend so much more time talking about what Suborbital and everyone else was doing. But, there's only so much that you can fit into a schedule. And I was already behind. And my editors were very patient with me. So I had to cut bait at some point.
That's fair. I think maybe a better way to put it in that case would be, you didn't skip over the essentials for somebody who's getting started with it to understand and appreciate what it is that goes behind developing software with WebAssembly. Because not only does it go straight into understanding how it is that WebAssembly works. I really appreciated that at the beginning you spent a lot of time also writing examples with WAT, with WebAssembly text format.
Mhm.
And that was cool because I felt like that was a way for me to start beginning to understand, not just beyond having that as something we can write. I know this sounds silly, but bear with me, please. Having it as a teaching tool
Mhm.
felt different with WAT, the way you used it in the book.
And I honestly I can't lay claim to that insight. The WebAssembly community had done that a lot, and
Yeah.
the first person who really ran with it was Kevin Hoffman in his Rust and WebAssembly book from the Pragmatic Programmers. I was traveling. I was in London at the time, and I had a couple of days to myself, and I just took his book and was reading outside, and it just blew my mind because in the first chapter, he basically builds about 60% of a checkers game in Watt.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe he was actually doing this. And, he got about 60-70% of the way there. And he goes, but nobody would actually do this. So let's switch over to Rust. But I mean, he was maintaining, positions and moving things around. And so, I mean, I really got the sense of kind of how to tell these stories from people like Kevin, and Lynn Clark has been a huge influence in terms of how I think about these things. So the
Yeah.
the WebAssembly community is a tremendous community, and like I said, Wasm.builders is now capturing and reflecting that in a very concentrated way. That's honestly, even for somebody who wrote a book on the topic, it's almost impossible to keep track of everything that's happening in this space on a daily basis.
Totally. And I think that's what's tricky about writing a book, I'll bet. But all the more appreciated of putting it there and being very, very upfront about saying this is how it is now. We'll see how it
Mhm.
is, in a year, 6 months time,
And I totally accept the criticism that it's too soon to have a definitive guide, but I wanted to use the term maybe not so much like it normally is used with the O'Reilly series, but to capture the scope of what I was trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And nobody had told that whole story, right? There were several great books out there targeting, like, Kevin's book Rust and WebAssembly, or other ones were like C++ and WebAssembly, and people like Robert Abou-Khalil's Leveling Up WebAssembly would walk you through things like converting existing C and C++ projects into these things. So people would tackle part of it, but nobody was telling the whole story about this vision that I was seeing emerge. And that's why I think stretched the title a little bit, given where we are in the process. But some of the other feedback that I got that was really meaningful to me was the idea that they thought I had done a good job of taking something that was so dynamic and giving it enough legs that, it came out in December. It wasn't useless by January, right?
A lot of what I read through it was, like you said, extremely relevant. And I appreciated that a lot, because the theory for something that's very I think it would be fair to say a lot of something that's very proposal driven that's going on right now with
Mhm.
WebAssembly can be tricky to write about. But I think by doing so in a way that's honest and saying like this is this is how it is and this is how it works has been really, I don't know if stabilizing is the right word, but grounding perhaps.
Yeah, I like that, and I think you've hit upon something about both why I think it works and why I think it's confusing. Why
Yeah.
this ecosystem is confusing is because we're so used to version numbers, right?
Mhm.
Version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and we're like, okay, well, what goes into each one of those things, and that sort of forces you into an all-in mentality, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what the WebAssembly community has been doing. They're basically saying, you adopt the pieces of it that you want to adopt when and where you want to adopt them or need to adopt them. And so the proposal-based process, like, okay, well, here's how we think about garbage collection, or here's how we think about 64-bit integers, or here's how we think about threading. It allows them the time to think through these items in isolation.
Yeah.
And it allows Wasm Time, Wasmer, Wasm 3, platforms to adopt them incrementally. And that way you're not having to buy into like everything all at once. And you can do feature testing and say, okay, this platform has the combination of things that I need, and therefore I can use it for the time being. But it allows the whole thing to be a little bit more organic and grow, I think, meaningfully, as opposed to crap. Everybody's got to support everything all at once, and that's just gonna, I think, force people's hands and have partial implementations or things that are flaky. And so I appreciate the fact that that's how it's going, but it does make it very confusing to keep track of what state everything is in.
All the more reason why I think having a book like this helps, because like for somebody like me, I remember again writing to Flaky when I was getting started with WebAssembly, being like, I can't keep up with all these terms, Wasm, Wazi, Wasmer, bundle, something else. I remember thinking like, gosh, where do I even begin? Having a guide like that really like guide takes you step by step through it. And one thing I actually found in the book that I wanted to touch upon that I don't see in a lot of books was dedicating the last couple of chapters to installation guides. That was cool. I just wanted to say I appreciated that.
Thank you. It's one of those trade-offs. The web is fantastic because it allows you to change something immediately. So if I had just put a link in there to say, okay, go to this website and find the instructions there,
yeah,
I wouldn't have had to spend so much time trying to get it. And I did in some cases, right?
Yeah.
But I for a lot of it, I wanted the book to stand on its own, so that somebody reading it out at lunch or something doesn't have to go back to work to look something up. I want most of it to be sort of self-contained and not force you to have to go look up a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So
no, that was super cool because it was grounded in reality, and I really appreciated that. And like you said, you can just try it out while you're reading it on a train or something.
right.
So that was really cool. Thank you. No, overall,
Sure.
I can say from my extremely unbiased point of view that it is absolutely a fantastic read, and to folks to check it out because it's very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and something Flaky says here I really liked as well, talking about writing things in WAT. Writing things by hand in Wasm is not unique to Wasm. The same trade-offs apply for Wasm stacked machine as they do for assembler and other real-world architectures. And it's funny you say that because it reminds me of a I think it's a book or a tutorial or a guide, I'm not sure what, I think it's called NAND to Tetris. I don't know if you've heard of this.
It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, this is like a guide to build your own Tetris out of NAND gates. I
Wow.
think. From what I understand, a friend has been telling me about it for years. I should get a link to that. I'll get it shortly.
I definitely want to check that out, because that's again, that sort of reinforces back to grounding these things in what's actually happening, right? And that's a technique that I've used with some of my semantic web discussions and training and everything. People are like, oh, this is so weird, and nobody does this, or why do we do this? Um, if you look at the history of the development of the internet and the web, it's just about adopting some standards to create increasingly interlinked graphs of stuff, right? Graphs of computers, graphs of documents, and now we're talking about graphs of data. And when you could contextualize things that way, right? Well, why is WebAssembly happening now, right?
Yeah.
It's not happening in isolation. It's been part of a 30-year attempt to improve the user experience of the web. And then the side effect is we're now able to address all these other things that are happening in the industry, like new hardware emerging, new deployment platforms, harder time being able to target those with a single language. I think part of the reason why, like, I thought Ruby on Rails was going to take over everything. And it obviously was a very successful platform. But I think the thing that stopped it was the runtime, right? You now had to go install another runtime, and everyone had already just installed JVMs and whatnot. So the idea that we can adopt a new language that maybe brings something to the table, like a Rust, like a Zig, like a Clojure, like a whatever, they bring something to the table in terms of our ability to express problems more elegantly, more efficiently, but we can then use them as part of our larger solutions without having to care, without having to install a new runtime just for that one language. I think that's part of what's interesting here as well. So it's in its contextualized form, WebAssembly makes all the sense in the world, and it doesn't seem like that weird of a thing. So
yeah,
that's why I like
you.
this NAND to Tetris thing, because it sounds like you're telling a story from first principles into what does it mean to have the capacity to additively build on success, right? And that's what I think WebAssembly is doing. Is it's additively building on the success of the web. It's additively building on the success of various languages and runtimes and compiler architectures, and our experience with portable and secure coding environments. And because it's not in your face, because it doesn't require you to necessarily care, that's why I think it seems like it's slow going, and it seems like it's been a long time in coming. But when you stop and see like all the places it's got its fingers and it's tightening its grip in those places, it just seems almost inevitable that it's going to be what we imagine it might be.
Thank you. Yeah. I've got a question here from Flacky. In today's era of computer purists, it's increasingly hard to stress the importance of the soft or human bits. Brian, how do you approach bringing cross-disciplinary thoughts to people?
I think that's one of the most important things that we need to do in our industry. And I've glibly tweeted things like, there's too much typing in our industry and not enough thinking, right? We're just copying and pasting things from Stack Exchange and not thinking about what that means. And when you try to systematize unthinking marginal changes, right? All these emergent conflicts and behaviors and things like the supply chain attacks that are becoming more of a problem, right? If you just sort of like have no problem adding another npm dependency on your node project, and that pulls in 5 other things, and you never stop and think about what does that mean, then this becomes a new attack vector that we're seeing all the time. And that's why I'm bullish on environments like Dino, because it takes that stuff seriously, right? Dino takes the same approach of that WebAssembly does, which is you do not get to write to the disk. You do not get to read to the disk. You do not get to open up a network connection. And when you combine those environments with the portability environments of that WebAssembly brings to the table, I think we have a recipe for solving, or at least materially improving, our security posture around malware and phishing attacks and ransomware and whatnot. Because if we can just arbitrarily run code naturally in sandboxed environments, then they're not going to have the capacity to cause havoc the way that they do now.
Right, and this is something you cover in the book as well, about how Dino provides these security mechanisms and how these are reflected in WebAssembly as well. And we got a follow up here from Flocky saying, "Oh, sorry."
I was just going to say I wasn't sure I fully had answered his question, but you know, I when I do consulting, right, I try to bring that to the table, right, and as part of the narratives around design elements and things like that. When I wrote the book, obviously I framed it in a way that tried to contextualize things and make it clear what the connection was and what the sequence was, and how we're adding capabilities, not jumping around in a decontextualized sort of way. So no, I don't have a specific simple answer to his question about it, but I do it by talking about it. And when I do training, I very much spend time, like for example, this week I did a 4-day architecture class. Day 1 introduced the terms, right? The ideas, the role of the architect, and then started to connect it to process and enterprise strategy and business value and managing market and technical uncertainty. So it was all just sort of like, here's architecture. The next day, I revisited those ideas from the interplay between, say, design patterns and architecture patterns. And like one is focusing on lower level things and one's focusing on higher level things. But like, again, just revisiting the ideas and how do we go back and forth between those two activities. Day 3 was then a deep dive into the web as an architecture, as an application level innovation on the internet's architecture, explaining why it works the way that it does, explaining why a browser doesn't have to stop and read API documentation when it hits a new website, and then extending it into linked data and other approaches. And then day 4 was, all right, let's look to the future. Like what's happening with hardware, what's happening with architecture, what's happening with decentralization, what's happening with, you know, I spent some time talking about WebAssembly, but revisiting those days, the topics from the previous days, you know, from historical, from contextual, from other perspectives. And so that's just kind of how I go about doing training and writing and conference talks and things like that. So I try to help people see the value without sort of like beating them over the head with it. So
I really appreciate that, and I think Flocky summarized it here quite well, where he said, you know, number 1, build credibility that lends you ears. Number 2, talking to those ears real good.
Yep, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Me too. You know, you mentioned consulting and training, so I guess that gives you, you know, a wide insight into what's going on in different parts of the of tech. And I'm wondering, has that, you know, helped bolster your belief that WebAssembly is a powerful contender for what's coming, and how it's and what insights can you glean from, you know, how that's being applied right now?
Yeah, I will say that in the past couple of years, because of the pandemic, I haven't been doing a lot of my more conventional consulting, but I think to the extent that I did for years, the thing that absolutely floors me is how oftentimes I'll come in as a consultant and, you know, there will be problems and I'll come up with solutions to those problems. But I find myself very often being more in my clients' best interests than their employees are, right? The employees are worried about their careers. Their employees are worried about their resumes. Their employees are worried about like political power and things like that. And sometimes that doesn't match to like what's the actual way to solve a problem. Most big companies are on this treadmill where they'll hire a new CIO, right? Fire the old one, bring in the new one. The new one has like some big ideas, and they're given about a year of leeway, and then the measurements start and nothing ever happens. And a year later, hey, we need a new CIO, right?
Right.
And so people are definitely spending money, but I don't know that they're spending money in a marginal additive way, right? I don't know that they're fixing problems. I think they're chasing shiny objects and big visions. And again, back to my technology Avengers, right? WebAssembly,
Yeah.
LLVM, ultimately, I think what we need to do as an industry is to figure out how to minimize the cost of computation, right? That's from a financial perspective, a time perspective, a latency perspective, and a power consumption perspective. And if you look at, why Apple's moving to ARM, it's because the RISC instruction set hardware uses less power, and therefore they can get better battery life out of it. But that's not enough. Like, they rewrote their operating system to take hold of how stuff gets scheduled at a threading level. And now they have custom hardware that's tuned for optimizing speed versus optimizing power. But we're seeing the same thing with researchers doing machine learning experiments with what order to apply LLVM optimizations to. Again, so the same code is either tuned for speed or power consumption. And it's that interplay between hardware, software, environments, runtimes, how we break things up into problems, that I think is ultimately going to help us decide, does something make sense to run in the cloud? Does something make sense to run on device? Does something make sense to run somewhere in between there, right? That's where edge computing environments come in. So I want to be able to run arbitrary software geographically closer to where my customers are, but not actually on-prem or on device. So then I need these environments like we're seeing Fastly and Cloudflare and other sorts of companies create, that allow you to take arbitrary code and run it in a safe, fast, sandboxed environment, which is then going to drive us towards environments like WebAssembly, right? Which is why they're so interested in that. So we can really take code and position it anywhere to optimize for speed, power consumption, latency, deal with regulatory compliance. Why do we push machine learning stuff to devices? Well, if you're doing like detecting whether somebody's got evidence of a stroke or something, you don't want to take the data off the sensor or
Right.
data off the device. You want to push the logic to the device and avoid HIPAA issues and whatnot. So in the grand scheme of things, when I look at in my consulting what works and what doesn't, and where can I add value well beyond how I'm being compensated, and yet they'll just turn around and piss it away some other way, that's frustrating. But what I see in this collection of technology superheroes, right, is a way for you to say, what do you actually want to do? I want to modernize my legacy systems. I want to improve my capacity to reduce costs to solve certain kinds of problems. Like, whatever your business problem is, we now have a technology story that helps you get there. And as I said, I think it largely comes down to capturing value for longer, and to not throw stuff away as fast as we do, to not rewrite stuff as often as we do. And so it's not that we're not going to be spending less money. It's that the money is going to move us forward, as opposed to, well, this CIO's project didn't work, so let's try the next CIO's project. In which case, you're just spending money and you're not necessarily getting any kind of return on investment on it.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And I think that speaks well to, and I appreciate the sincerity there, because I think it's important for us to be honest with ourselves and say, what's what's not working and what can we do better with the technology that we have provided to us. So thank you for that, Brian. Listen, I can see that we're coming up on the hour. I want to give folks one last opportunity to ask a question. But if not, I just want to say this has been super cool, Ryan. I really appreciate you taking the time. I've learned loads, and it's really cool to learn from somebody who's, you can tell cares and, has a wealth of experience. So thank you for that.
It's a polite way of saying I'm old.
No, that's not what I mean.
Just kidding.
I know. And I appreciate it. No, it's been really cool. Thank you,
Sure.
Brian. Before I bring Connor back in to take us out, how do you prefer folks get in touch with you?
Twitter's the easiest way. Just reach out and poke me there. But I mean, find me on LinkedIn as well. That's a pretty straightforward approach. So
cool. Thank you very much. So I'm gonna bring Connor back in.
Thank you.
Hey, Connor.
Hello. How's it going? This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity too.
Yeah, my name tag like covers my chin. I feel like I need to move over here.
You can take off the banner. One second.
That's all good.
That'll do it.
That's all good. Yeah, no, this was great. I really appreciate all the different perspectives and all the different angles you both took on this conversation. So before we head out, obviously thanks to both of you for doing this, but I also want everybody to know about Wasm.builders. That is, the community site that we are attaching this Fireside Chat to. So head on over to Wasm.builders. It is a great place to learn about WebAssembly. There are now hundreds of posts. We've seen a really great group of people creating tutorials and walkthroughs and showcases of different things that they're using WebAssembly to do. And, the group of teams that are working together to curate and, be the administrators of that. We're all very passionate WebAssembly folks, and we're really quite excited that the community is growing at the rate that it is. So definitely check out Wasm.builders. Thank you again to both of you. Keep an eye on the Wasm.builders Twitter account for future Fireside Chats. We kind of trade off among the different companies that are involved with Wasm.builders. And so the next one won't be on our YouTube channel, but it will be promoted. No matter who's hosting it, it will be promoted on the Wasm.builders Twitter account. So at Wasm.builders on Twitter, give that a follow to be notified when the next ones are coming up. So thank you very much, and I think we can end it there.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.